Ignore the Dementor, a Harry Potter fanfiction written by NinjaPandaScholar on AO3. Read by Coul. This chapter is 26 chapters long. I will be recording them in sets of 3. Now enjoy. Chapter 1. Ignore the Dementor. With the death of Cedric Diggory and the rebirth of Voldemort, Harry Potter's life was looking decidedly worse than it had been a year before. Not that it had been unicorns and rainbows before. He was sinking more and more into a state of constant anxiety that left him unable to think clearly or have a desire to do anything at all. That didn't stop his relatives from piling so many chores on him that his fingers were raw and his shoulders were sore though. Nothing had ever stopped that. Adding to the stress, Harry wasn't allowed a copy of the magical community's newspaper because Albus Dumbledore, headmaster, leader of the light, and a ridiculous amount of other titles had been worried that Voldemort and his Death Eaters would try to track the owl. Therefore, he had no clue as to what was going on in the world beside what his active imagination could come up with, which was pretty bad. It was a rare moment of rest that found Harry sitting in a swing at the playground close to his relative's house on Privet Drive. Not his house. The Dursleys had made that abundantly clear his entire life. Sitting still led to the anxiety catching up with him once more, and Harry desperately tried to still his mind and calm the adrenaline that seemed to constantly be rushing through his veins these days. He assumed he was doing a type of meditation, but he figured he must not be doing it very well since it didn't seem to help any at all to his added frustration. The meditation did help drown out what was going on around him, so it was only with a slight flicker of recognition that Harry even realized his cousin and the thugs he hung out with were talking to him, or more than likely insulting or taunting him. He really didn't care anymore. They could do their worst, and he couldn't bring himself to even process that he should feel anything. Eventually, Harry rose from the swing and walked, zombie-like, through the gang back towards number 4. This seemed to confuse the mocking teens who sulkily dispersed, since he wasn't being any fun, leaving Dudley trailing along behind him and yelling out more insults along the way. What finally brought Harry out of his stupor halfway back to the house was a shiver that ran up and down his spine as the temperature dropped from a boiling hot tea to where he could see his breath in front of his face. "Dementors!" he yelled out to a stunned Dudley behind him before he took off running towards the safety of the bloodwarts around the house. His cousin apparently wasn't as stupid as he looked, since he took off running as well, since seeing that Harry was afraid of whatever was going on, he had to take back his generous thoughts though, as one of the lone Dementor glided into their path, blocking them from continuing to the safety of the wards. "Stop!" Harry called out to Dudley and pulled his wand, But Dudley continued racing forward until he tripped into Harry. Dudley crashed to the ground, effectively knocking himself unconscious as Harry's wand went flying. Panicked, Harry scrambled to the ground to grab his wand, scratching up his hands and knees on the concrete. The tips of his fingers grazed the comforting wood of the wand, as all hope was ripped away in the form of a skeletal hand that lifted him bodily from the ground, and at a hopeless distance from the wand's protection. Harry's life did not flash before his eyes. Instead, the faces of those he'd been leaving behind were brought to the front of his mind, while the Dementor took a deep, rattling breath. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry," he whispered out sadly into the world, not exactly sure what he was apologizing for, just as he felt his soul being ripped forcibly from his body. A Dementor's kiss is not painless. He'd read once that it was believed to be. Well, they'd be dead wrong. It felt like every single cell in his body was being ripped apart, and he could feel each and every one of them. He screamed a horrifying scream out into the dark evening as he finally felt himself torn away from the body that used to house him. Well, shit, was the profound thought that crossed Harry's mind as he stared down at the body that used to be him, lying on the pavement beside his unconscious cousin. Wait, why am I still here? Harry felt like himself. Not only he seemed to be floating instead of standing. Maybe he was a ghost, he thought. The Dementor was floating away from him into the night before turning back to the teen. One long, pale and skeletal hand reached out from the tattered cloak and beckoned Harry to follow. Scoffing, Harry crossed his skeletal arms inside of his tattered robe to tell the Dementor to bugger off. That was until he realized he had skeletal arms inside of a tattered robe, and he was floating above the ground instead of standing. Merlin's saggy balls! I'm a Dementor! He exclaimed in his mind. In trepidation, the new Dementor reached up under its hood to feel what was there. Harry felt solid, surprisingly. There was a mouth with chapped lips, lip balm. He could invest in lip balm. Now up higher, he gasped when he felt no nose. Oh, hell no! I look like Voldemort! He mentally grumbled. There was a moment when his thoughts stuttered and he thought he might pass out when he realized he also had no eyes. He was seeing, though. How? It was actually more like sensing, he realized. He sensed the Dementor in front of him and his body at his feet. He knew where they were and what they would look like, but he didn't actually see them. Frankly, he figured he actually saw a little better now that he did with his than when he did with his glasses. He thought, with a humorless snort. He opened his mouth to tell the Dementor, but only a long, haunting screech came out. For some reason, he knew that he'd actually said, "There's no way in hell I'm going with you, and you can very well bugger off, or I'll see if a Dementor can suck another one's soul out." All that just sounded like a combination of a birds of prey screech and a death rattle, if that made any sense at all. "Have it your way," wafted back to him as in the form of a similar screech from the other Dementor, before it continued on its way, as if it hadn't just destroyed someone's life. "We'll see you again, Harry Potter," drifted back to him ominously as the Dementor faded from sight. Dementor Harry looked down once more at his body and tried to remember all he knew of what happened to someone after they were kissed. Well, they didn't die, was the first and only thing that was coming to mind. So his body down there must still be alive. He reached down with his skeletal hand and to take a hold of the tanned and calloused hand that he once called his own. He gasped a rattling breath as his hand went right through his old one. Quickly he reached over and poked Dudley's hand. Nope, that was solid. So it was only his body then. Maybe? Harry floated down to his old body and fell into it horizontally. It was like one of the weirdest feelings he'd ever experienced. It was like he was getting dressed up in an uncomfortable suit. It was painfully obvious he was no longer connected to his body and couldn't reconnect himself. However, when he moved the arms, they moved. He tried to move the facial features and then his legs. It all worked for him, but felt completely wrong. Finally, he stood, wearing his Harry suit, and looked down at his unconscious cousin. There was no way he was going to be able to carry him home. So he nudged the larger teen with his foot. With a groan, Dudley shifted slightly. "Dudley, you fell. Can you stand on your own?" Harry asked him, testing out his voice, with a sigh in relief when it was in English and not whatever Dementor language he'd been speaking before. He could do this, right? He'd just wear his Harry suit and pretended that nothing bad happened. No one knew. No one had to know. Dudley blinked and looked up at Harry with fear in his eyes and a scream in his lungs. Harry winced and felt his aura extending out around him and tried out pulling it inside of himself. As Dudley passed back out, Harry grimaced. "Guess I'll have to work on that." Harry's aunt and uncle were not amused. Dudley had finally woken up and Harry had gotten them home. No one believed that Dudley had tripped and knocked himself out, which was ironic since he actually had done just that before the whole Dementor drama. They all seemed too afraid of Harry to do much about it, though. Harry couldn't really decide if that was a pro or a con, but he was leaning decidedly towards pro. He really was trying, and mostly succeeding at keeping his Dementor aura in check. When the verbal abuse got too much and he had started losing control of his emotions, it was hard to keep everything reined in, though. There were many less arguments in the Dudley's household after a couple of slips in his control. He wasn't proud of the fact that his relatives were terrified of him, but since he'd been afraid of them for well over a decade of his life. He wasn't letting the guilt overtake him too much. As much as he now felt like the freak the Dursleys had always told him he was also knocked out of his vicious cycle of anxiety over Voldemort. Now he had a new cycle of anxiety about turning into a Dementor, wearing a hairy suit around, and what his friends and the Ministry would do when they found out. He tried to act as normally as possible, but he no longer needed to eat or sleep, and that was a little noticeable. After a little over a day, he came to the uncomfortable conclusion that he did have to make his human body eat, even if he had to force the food down or his hairy suit would die. The body had become more and more sluggish when he didn't feed it, and he realized that it still needed sustenance even if he didn't. As weird as he felt wearing himself around like clothes, he refused to carry around a smelly, dead body. As for sleep, he found out that if he left his body at night, then the natural state it would go into was one of sleep. So he made sure to take off his body for at least 6 or 7 hours each night to let the body sleep and stay healthy. Frankly, after a week of forcing down food and making his body sleep, the hairy suit was looking much healthier than Harry did when he was actually alive in it, since he'd been having constant nightmares and had little appetite before everything happened. While the hairy suit slept, Dementor Harry floated around the back garden, trying to figure out if he had any new Dementor powers, besides flying and presumably sucking out souls, which he wasn't ever going to try. He couldn't figure out anything else. Flying was pretty awesome, though. It was the one good thing about being sucked out of his body and becoming a horrifying monster. He felt free, finally, as he soared into the sky high over England and rode the air currents. It was 100 times better than flying on his broom. He wanted to test if he could still do wizard magic, but that was a sure way to get expelled over the summer. He just hoped and prayed that when he went back to Hogwarts, his wand would continue to work for him. Since he would be pulling the magic from the hairy suit, theoretically, he believed it would still work. Hopefully. Now, explaining all this does seem like Harry was taking everything really well. He wasn't. Yes, he was keeping his new pet alive. When did he start to think of his body as a pet? And he was flying most nights. But he was also screaming into the clouds, cursing fate and the world and Voldemort and everyone, and crying real tears when he was back in his body and had tear ducts again. He was also cold all the time, and this made him even more miserable. He found that letting his Dementor aura go warmed him up as everything around him froze, but pulling it in caused his body to feel like it was winter in the dungeons of Hogwarts instead of the middle of summer. His relatives probably thought he was insane. Well, they already thought that for years, as he wore multiple layers of clothes while doing his chores in blazing heat. The Dudleys couldn't care less about Harry or his life, so any abnormalities or strangeness went largely unnoticed. The real test would be when Remus Lupin arrived to take him to wherever everyone was hiding out over the summer. He'd gotten a letter from Dumbledore on his birthday, which he'd completely forgotten about in his distress at turning into the monster from his nightmares, and which said that Remus would be by on August 2nd to pick him up for the rest of the summer. As August 2nd arrived, much too quickly, Harry sat on his trunk in his room, going over and over his new mantra of just act normal, don't scare the villagers, don't suck out any souls, and be Harry. Not the monster, you're not the monster. He didn't believe himself, no matter how much he tried to told himself that. Then the front doorbell rang, and Vernon grumbled an order up the stairs for him to get a move on. Harry sighed and picked up Hedwig in her cage. "You ready, girl?" he asked as she gave him a happy hoot. The only thing that kept him sane was that Hedwig hadn't abandoned him. He reasoned that if he were truly evil, then Hedwig would have left him the first chance she got. Instead, she flew with him at night and comforted him in both his human and his Dementor forms. There was no person in the world he loved as much as he loved his owl, and he made sure she knew that every chance he got with treats, words, head scratches, and generally treating her like the queen she was. "Time to face the humans," he told her wryly as they made their way out of the room and down the stairs to see the very observant werewolf. Chapter 2. A New Home. Remus Lupin was standing just inside of the Dursleys' front door with a large, shaggy dog beside him. Harry paused on the stairs in fear, not having known that his Dementor-sensitive godfather would be there as well. "Hi, Professor Lupin!" Harry forced a smile as he pulled in his aura as much as it was possible to do. "Harry, I haven't been your professor for well over a year. Remus or Mooney will work perfectly fine." The man laughed, dressed shabbily in Muggle clothes the same as he did in wizard robes. The dog gave a happy bark beside him. "Good to see you then, Remus." Harry smiled at him with a cautious step forward. Harry's Aunt Petunia looked at the man and the dog as if a herd of cockroaches had tracked sewage to her front parlor. "Harry, boys!" She sneered up as her hand inched towards a can of disinfectant spray that was sitting on the counter, presumably waiting for as soon as the wizards walked out the door, though Harry thought she was probably a heartbeat from spraying them down bodily if they stayed any longer. "Of course, Aunt Petunia," Harry mumbled as he hurried down the rest of the stairs, where the werewolf gave him a quick half-hug. "You look different, Harry." Remus studied the teen as he had an arm around them. "Really?" Harry almost panicked, thinking he was going to be found out before he even got out of the front door. "It's been a while since you last saw me." "That must be it." Remus nodded with a smile. "You look good. Healthier, I think." "We'll get going then." Vernon almost shoved them out of the front door in impatience and some still lingering fear of the new Dementor. Harry chuckled as he heard the familiar aerosol sound of a can of disinfectant spray as the door was closing behind them. "Hey, Siri," Harry finally said as he gave the dog a pat on the head. Thankfully, Sirius only barked happily and licked Harry's arm instead of reacting negatively to his godson. "Have you ever sidelong apparated?" Remus asked when they travelled down the street towards the park. No. Is it like a portkey?" Harry asked, pulling his trunk over the uneven ground behind him and holding Hedwig's cage so she didn't get jostled. Remus gave him a wolfish smile and took a hold of both Harry's arm and the scruff behind Sirius' neck. "Hold on to your owl and trunk tightly. It's best to just get it over with." Harry was furious. They made his hairy suit throw up. He promised himself to never side-along apparate ever again, and there. There, it does get better, Remus ineffectually assured him as he awkwardly patted the retching teen's back. "I need you to read this piece of paper once you feel well enough." Sirius gamboled around them, chasing pigeons and trying to distract his godson from his stomach flipping over itself. "Is there a single pleasant form of wizard transportation?" Harry asked seriously as he grabbed the extended piece of paper to read something about an Order of the Phoenix and a house address. "What?" Brooms aren't too bad." Remus shrugged as Harry stared in awe at where the massive townhouse appeared in the middle of the neighborhood, where there hadn't been one before. "Sirius will probably want to apologize for his mother later, but for now, try to be quiet as we enter." "What?" Harry asked him again dazedly, as he followed his old professor up to the front steps, while Sirius dug his heels in, following behind them. Hedwig squawked, and Harry let her out of her cage just before entering so she could fly off and hunt. Walking in, Harry took in a deep breath and smiled. The house felt so homey and welcoming. Just the aura of it seemed to reach out to him and give him a hug. If this was Sirius' home, which he figured it must be if his mother was around somewhere, he hoped he'd be able to spend a lot of time here. They passed a heavily curtained portrait and entered into a sitting room where Sirius turned back into his human form. "Oh, Pup, it's so good to see you again." He pulled the teen into a bear hug. Harry had a tight hold on his aura, keeping it as much inside of himself as possible while he held his breath, hoping Sirius wouldn't notice. "I'm glad you're here, Petfoot. Where are we?" Sirius pulled back and sneered. My childhood home. I'm sorry, Harry. This place is awful. My relatives were the darkest of dark, and this house is just infested with cursed objects and bad juju. At least I was able to offer the protection of the wards to the order, though. The portrait in the entryway is of my thankfully deceased mother. If you make noise, she screeches to High Haven." Harry raised an eyebrow. The house seemed more than fine to him. Sure, it was a little dusty and grimy, but a feather duster and a wet cloth would have that fixed in no time. As Remus nodded along with Sirius's assessment, Harry decided to keep his mouth shut. He figured maybe this was a Dementor thing and the darkness of the house fit him now. Regardless, he was already looking forward to his stay. So, the Order of the Phoenix thingy I read about that made the house appear? Yes, Dumbledore put this organization together. They call themselves the Order of the Phoenix. They came together in the First War to fight against Voldemort. Now that he's back, everyone's been called up to join again, Remus explained, sitting in an armchair by the unlit fire. Harry was wondering what the odds were of getting someone to light the fire even though it was summer. Awesome! So, things are actually being done to fight the bastard? Harry asked in interest. He hoped he'd be told something now that he was no longer in the Muggle world. Actually, both sides are mainly just recruiting now. The Animagus explained as he seemed to look over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. Harry looked back as well, wondering why he'd be worried in his own house. Voldemort has been really quiet lately, with no major attacks. Yeah, mate! Heads up, a lot of people don't believe he's come back, a familiar redhead added as he walked into the room with a large smile. Harry! A head of bushy brown hair flew past Ron and tackled Harry into a hug. The Dementor sighed in disappointment. He'd hoped to ease his way into being around people in his new form. With Ron and Hermione, and probably the rest of the Weasleys in the house, someone was bound to discover that something wasn't quite right with him. He figured he was expected to act excited to see his friends, though. So he tried his best to summon up an excited look and to push his anxieties down. Hey, moin! Hey, Miney, Harry finally said with a fake smile. We've been so worried about you, she exclaimed and looked over him for injuries, which wasn't usually out of the realm of possibilities after a summer with Dudley. You look good, healthier than I remember, especially at the end of a summer. Harry shrugged. He'd never been good about taking care of himself, but he was excellent at taking care of his pets. Harry's suit included. It helped that his relatives were so afraid of him by the end of the summer that they didn't say anything when he took food from the kitchen like they usually would have. What's the ministry saying about Voldy's return? Nothing at all. Well, that he hasn't returned, Ron said with a tentative look like Harry might blow up at him with anger. Harry's eyes widened and he shook his head. Well, that's stupid, was the only thing he said before looking around the room. Is there a place I can put my trunk? I'd hate for someone to trip over it out here in the middle of the room. Sirius hefted the trunk up as Ron and Hermione stared at Harry in confusion at his lack of outburst. Follow me, pup. You're bunking with Ron. We have a bit of a full house at the moment. After dropping the trunk at the front of the bed in his room with 2 twin beds, a small cupboard, and a portrait of a severe-looking wizard, Sirius gave Harry one more hug before leaving him to settle in. Watch what you touch, pup. We're still finding some cursed objects around, Sirius warned on his way out before he was replaced in the doorway by Ron and Hermione. Harry, it doesn't bother you that the Ministry doesn't believe you? Hermione asked while Harry opened his trunk and rummaged around for an old Weasley jumper to add another layer to stave away the cold. Course it does, Hermione, Harry said as he pulled out the jumper and tucked it on over the long-sleeved shirt he was already wearing. It really didn't bother him, but he was a Dementor now. The way he saw it, there wasn't much more Voldemort could do to him. If he killed the Harry suit, then Dementor Harry could just suck out his soul. At that thought, Harry shuddered. He really didn't want to ever do that. He'd never be welcomed into the Wizarding Society again, and would probably be exiled to Azkaban. His new plan was to stay as far away from the war and conflict as possible to avoid the one-way ticket to Azkaban he knew would eventually come in his future. He remembered from the Defense Against the Dark Arts that Dementors couldn't be killed but being forced to live in Azkaban for however long he'd live as a Dementor seemed worse than death. He couldn't exactly explain that to his friends, though. Well, the way I see it, I'm only 15, Harry said slowly, weighing what he could tell his friends. I told the Ministry and Dumbledore everything that happened, and I've stopped Voldemort from coming back about 3 times now. It was going to happen eventually with that record. I've done my part, and now it's their job. More like a job for the humans, he added on at the back of his mind. Ron looked at him like he'd gone crazy, while Hermione had a look on her face that Harry would imagine a proud parent would look like. Ron shook his head. So, you're not going to be mad when we get chased out of the kitchen for order meetings we aren't allowed to attend? He asked with a disbelieving look in his eyes. And be around more people who could figure out he was a Dementor? Nope. Nah. It's not like they're going to send teenagers out on missions anyway. Harry grinned and clapped a hand on Ron's shoulder. Now, Ron, it's dinner time. Is your mom here, or are we going to be subjected to what someone who was a prisoner of 12 years can cook? Now Hermione looked at him incredulously. Harry never asked about food. He normally forgot about meal times unless someone reminded him. Yeah, mate. Mom and the others are waiting in the kitchen. They just wanted to give you some space to settle in. Ron grinned and led the way out of the room. Harry did actually quietly groan when he took in the kitchen that was completely filled with people. All the Weasleys were there except for Charlie and Percy. Remus and Sirius were there, of course. There was a younger woman with spiky pink hair. The real, hopefully, Mad-Eye Moody and Snape seemed to be trying to hide in the corner. After hugs from a sea of redheads, Harry was seated at the table that was filled with overflowing bowls of food. Harry was never hungry anymore, and nothing had any taste at all. Fortunately, eating didn't cause any nausea, so he just had to force the food down to keep his suit alive. So, since nothing tasted good anyway, he piled his plate with the only healthiest options, making sure he had some green vegetables, some protein, and very few carbo- carbohydrates. The twins immediately started raging on him about which girl he was trying to impress by getting in better shape, to which Mrs. Weasley slapped them both on the back of the head, lightly with a wooden spoon. You two could learn a little from Harry and eat more vegetables, she scolded the unrepentant duo.
Why do you look so blurry?
Mad-Eye Moody bluntly accused, from where he was sitting diagonally from Harry. Harry almost panicked at the question. He'd forgotten Mad-Eye's magical eye.
What do you mean, blurry?
He stalled. The retired Auror stared at him, causing his skin to crawl almost unpleasantly.
I don't know, boy. I've never seen the likes. You look out of focus,
he said with an irritated huff.
Maybe you need to get your eye checked.
Snape finally spoke from where he was still sitting in a shadow.
The boy has been stuck in the Muggle world for 2 months. What could he have done to mess with your eye?
Harry gaped at the man. Sure, Snape didn't know he was saving him, but Harry could have hugged the dungeon bat then and there. Of course, everyone would know something was wrong with him then.
Yeah, just a normal summer,
Harry added on at the end, trying to not show his relief at the save. Moody continued to mutter to himself until everyone was distracted by Dumbledore's appearance at the door. After Dumbledore's quick greeting to Harry, the Dementor completely zoned out on that conversation. Dumbledore was wearing the brightest robes he has ever seen, in a dark purple with twinkling silver stars all over it. The stars transfixed Harry's eyes. They were so beautiful. If only he could touch a star, he'd maybe have the robe to hang on his wall. Yeah, he could look at it every day then. He could then cut out a star and put it in his pocket to pull out any time he wanted to see it. It took calling out his name 3 times and Hermione talking on his sleeve before Harry realized people had been talking to him.
Huh?
He asked dazedly, trying to pull his eyes away from the wonderful stars. Apparently, Dementors liked shiny things. A lot.
I asked if you'd have any more visions of Voldemort, my boy,
Dumbledore said with a chuckle.
Do you like my robes? They're new.
The headmaster gave a little spin, causing the stars to blur together a bit and shine even brighter. Harry had to tear his gaze away and literally sat on his hands to keep from reaching out for the fabric.
Yeah, your robes are really nice. I like the stars,
he said lamely, trying not to gush, as non-Dementor Harry would never have loved robes such as the ones the headmaster was wearing.
And no, I haven't had any visions, sorry.
Actually, since his soul was sucked out of his body, he'd had no visions, dreams, or even scar twinges. It seemed that the connection he had with Voldemort was completely gone. He vaguely wondered if he could still speak to snakes. It didn't take long before the Order members shooed the teens off to bed to have their meeting. As Harry said he would earlier, he went without protest. He knew he would have been angry to be left out of things a month before, He was angry at. Now, though, the farther he could be from the action, the longer he could avoid Azkaban for, he reasoned.
Those robes were really something else, weren't they?
Ron laughed as they both fell into their beds.
I can't believe the most powerful wizard in our world has fashion sense like that.
Yeah, Harry agreed and made a mental note to watch himself around shiny things in the future. It seemed his Dementor couldn't be trusted to keep his hands to himself when presented with pretty objects. Ron was asleep within half an hour. After a couple of snores sounded out into the room, Harry peeled himself away from his body and watched as it fell into sleep peacefully. He looked around the room with his Dementor eyes and decided that it was definitely that part of him that liked the house. It was almost like he could see better with the aura of the house surrounding him. It soothed his emotions and calmed his anxiety somewhat. Ron didn't seem to be affected by Harry being outside of his body yet. Anyway, the man from the portrait was not in residence at the time, so Harry took a minute to check over his body, some to make sure everything looked all right. After determining his pet was fine, he decided it needed a name. He couldn't just keep referring to it as the Harry suit in his head. It was living and breathing, if soulless, and deserved a name. He quickly discounted Har, as it sounded too much like hair. Ree just didn't seem like him. James was his father's name. Jamie? That would work. Jamie, he whispered to himself in his mind. Yes, that's what he would call his former body. The order was still meeting downstairs, so Harry glided through the closed window, something he was happy to learn was possible since he hadn't tried it before, and flew off into the night, looking for Hedwig. After finding his owl and flying together for a bit, Harry tried to figure out how to disappear into shadows like the Dementor in Surrey had done when he was leaving after having destroyed Harry's life. He didn't know if it was a type of transport or invisibility, though. 4 hours later, and Hedwig was still hooting good-humoredly at him as he ran into walls, trying to transport himself somewhere.
Stop laughing at me, he pouted at his owl. I learned to fly my first try. How long did it take you?
Hedwig just continued to hoot in a way that closely resembled chuckles, while Harry pulled a tub of lip balm out of his tattered robes and applied it to his chapped lips with pale skeletal hands. As much as he used it, it never seemed to help very much.
Maybe it's just invisibility and not travel,
he finally admitted. He had been hoping for a better way of travel than what he'd experienced in the wizarding world. Another 2 hours and Harry had finally figured out how to turn himself invisible and disappear into any shadow around himself. Hedwig almost fell off her branch the first time he was successful, wondering where her Dementor had gone to.
Yes!
Harry laughed, which sounded more like the gasps of a dying man. But Hedwig knew what they were, and that's all that mattered. Dawn was approaching as Harry made his way back into Grimmauld Place. It seemed that the Dementor's sense of direction was impeccable. He figured that would definitely be useful one day. After a quick check that Ron was still asleep, Harry glided back into the room and made his way over Jamie. A loud squeak sounded from the corner of his room, and Harry whirled around. The stern-looking man rushed out of his portrait in fear. Harry stared at it for a second more before shrugging. He quickly merged back with his body and pretended to be asleep. That lasted for 3 seconds before a high-pitched wail of alarm sounded throughout the house. Chapter 3. My Precious. Ron and Harry both shut up in their beds. Footsteps pounded down the hallway, and their door was thrown open by a scared werewolf wearing slippers and a blue housecoat. "That's the emergency alarm!" Remus called out with his wand drawn. "Everyone is to meet down in the kitchen. Hurry! Stick with me!" Throwing back their covers, Ron and Harry rushed out of the room and into the stream of people rushing down to the kitchen. Harry's mind was reeling. Whatever was going on had to have something to do with the portrait seeing him. But how could a portrait have set off some sort of emergency alarm? He needed an excuse, and fast. Everyone was in various stages of undress, were sleepily crammed in the kitchens at Grimold Place. Sirius looked like he probably didn't sleep in anything, since he was only wearing his jeans from the day before that weren't zipped up. Harry saw Mr. Weasley whisper to his godfather, who quickly zipped and buttoned the trousers with a roll of his eyes instead of any embarrassment. Ginny and Hermione were both leaning against each other, looking like they could fall asleep at any point in time, and the Weasley twins were already asleep once more, propped up in the corner. The only people who looked on the alert and ready for danger were Remus and Snape. Harry was very confused about why the potion master must be staying at the house. He was wearing his normal black robes and seemed way too awake to have been woken up by the alarm. Both Snape and Remus had their wands out and stood in front of the others while obviously waiting on the arrival of someone. The kitchen door opened, and the two alert men visibly let out a sigh of relief when Albus Dumbledore, wearing a pink and green dressing gown, entered through it. "This had better not be another of your drills," Snape sneered menacingly at his employer. "Unfortunately, it isn't." Dumbledore looked around the room and seemed to be counting up the residents anxiously. His gaze lingered for a second on Harry, and the old man's face softened in relief and care. "Phineas woke me up screaming that a monster was in the boys' room not 5 minutes ago. I checked the house, and I can't find anything out of the ordinary now, though." "Really?" Snape narrowed his eyes suspiciously at Harry, not even looking over to where Ron was sneaking a biscuit out of the tin on the counter. "What sort of monster did the former headmaster think he was?" Dumbledore waved his wand, and tea started making itself on the stove, and the tin of biscuits flew out of Ron's hands onto the table. "He wasn't sure, only that it was tall, cloaked, and hooded." Headmaster, I think he may just have seen me," Harry added tentatively. He'd worked out a quick excuse, and the description of the portrait had given him, thank Merlin, fit within his hastily constructed excuse quite well.
Oh, really, my boy? Dumbledore turned twinkling eyes to his favorite student. Were you tall, cloaked, and hooded in your room? The Dementor in hiding chuckled to dismiss the concern. I don't think anyone has ever called me tall, sir. However, I woke up early and couldn't go back to sleep. I decided to go through my trunk and pull out some damaged school robes. I was trying them on to see if they could be repaired or if I'd need to replace them before school starts again. I guess if you saw someone in a cloak in the dark that you believed to be asleep, it would be a bit concerning. I didn't know the portrait was in our room. It was connected to you, sir. I thought he was just a normal house portrait. Harry was more than a little upset that he'd been put in his room with a portrait directly connected to the headmaster's office. It seemed like a huge breach of privacy in his mind. He really didn't want to make a big deal out of it, though, as he didn't want any more attention on him, or the fact that he was only borrowing the body he was currently in. He prayed that it be all passed over and the headmaster would buy his excuse. I completely agree, Harry. Dumbledore smiled at the teen. I'd probably would have been concerned to see someone in a cloak standing over your bed in the dark as well. Maybe next time go through your robes in the daylight. Sounds good. He gave a little laugh at the end, very happy the teen was safe and that this was all a happy misunderstanding. Snape glared at his student as if the alarm was completely Harry's fault. It was, but only because no one had told him that his portrait was a spy. Harry avoided the man's eyes, fully aware he tended to see more than others did when he looked at his students directly. Harry didn't know how he knew when someone was lying, but he figured it couldn't hurt to not give the man the opportunity to study his face in more detail. The teapot and mugs joined the biscuits on the table, and Mrs. Weasley started pouring cups for everyone. Well, I guess back to bed for everyone who thinks they can go back to sleep, and good morning to everyone who can't, Dumbledore said as he turned to leave the room once more. Remus turned to the teens as well as the three adults who hadn't been fully alert. All right, you lot. We need to have a discussion about emergency procedures and what it means if the alarm goes off. I'll leave you to it, Lupin. Snape shot a parting glare over at Harry before leaving the room in a swirl of robes. Harry... Why is he staying here anyways? Harry whispered to Ron as Remus started in on having your wands and shoes accessible at all times during a war. Ron shrugged as he chewed his biscuit. He has a potions lab set up in the attic. I'm not sure if he's actually staying here or if he's just brewing a lot of potions. He pops up at random times like an evil bat. Well, I, for one, don't think I'll be changing my clothes in our room anymore, Harry remarked dryly as Ron paled and coughed on the bit of biscuit he had inhaled. No one was able to get back to sleep after the 45-minute lecture by Remus Lupin on emergency preparedness. Molly Weasley eventually gave up and started cooking breakfast around the time that Sirius conjured shadow puppets to appear on the wall behind the werewolf. And Padfoot, if you of all people as a former Auror should know to at least sleep in your pants in case you have to run and fight. Remus concluded after a stinging hex at the Laughing man. "Oh, Moony, I'll just fight in the buff. Everyone would be so distracted by my magnificence that I'd take them all out." Sirius winked at Harry when his godson couldn't hold back a chuckle at that claim. Remus threw his hands in the air and stormed out of the room, presumably to either get ready for the day or booby trap his friend's room. Maybe both. "Eat all up?" Mrs. Weasley stated as she plopped eggs and bacon onto the table. "Serious? I'm having the kids clean the upstairs library today. Could you get that house elf of yours to do anything in another part of the house so he can't keep stealing the things we toss out?" she asked exasperatedly. The atmosphere quickly turned into almost a party as everyone made fun of each other's pajamas and speculated on if Snape ever slept or if he wore his teaching robes to bed. Sirius was telling stories of his time at Hogwarts as the twins and surprisingly Arthur Weasley eagerly questioned him. Harry sat back with a smile on his face until that smile suddenly fell. He realized he was hungry. He shoved a couple of pieces of bacon and eggs down his throat already and wasn't used to being hungry at all anymore. The hunger he was feeling was almost palpable, though. He felt that if he didn't eat something soon, he'd implode into the empty space in his stomach. It only took one more bite of eggs before he realized that Jamie wasn't hungry. The Dementor was. The laughter filled and good mood of those around him was swirling tangibly in front of his face. He knew he could pull it in, those happy moments and good feelings, if he only took a little. There wasn't much, if any, conscious thought that went into Harry skimming a little of the good mood off of the top of the room. He pulled it in, feeling the emptiness within him fill and a warmth blossom in his heart. He only skimmed a little, and no one seemed to notice. Well, no one besides Sirius Black. Sirius stopped mid-sentence and let out a little gasp. His head shot up to look around the room. Immediately, Harry pulled in his aura as much as possible and didn't touch the mood in the room anymore. It took a few seconds, but Sirius seemed to brush off the feeling and turned his attention back to the conversation he was in. When everyone was distracted once more, Harry quickly stood from the table and rushed out of the kitchen and back to his bedroom. Never again, never again, never again! He kept thinking over and over in his head. No feeding from friends and family. Nope, never again! The guilt was eating him alive, and he crashed onto his bed and buried his face in his pillow. The even worse part of it all was he was still hungry. He'd never been hungry before since he was changed. But he'd never been around happy people either. The Dursleys were all bad feelings and irritation. After feeding the little that he had, Harry could still feel everyone in the house in the back of his mind and what their emotion currently was at the time. From where his head was buried in his pillow, Harry could tell that Sirius was still a little weirded out. Mrs. Weasley was feeling stressed. The twins were both excited. Ron was tired. Mr. Weasley was peaceful. Hermione was a little concerned, probably about him. Ginny was curious about something. Remus was feeling mischievous, and Snape was annoyed and more than a little stressed. "Why?" He yelled into his pillow, "I can't do this!" "May I ask what it is you feel you can't do?" a voice drawled from the other side of the room. Harry shut up in the bed, his glasses askew. He'd forgotten about the painting. "You're Phineas, right?" he asked as he straightened his glasses once more. The man's eyes narrowed and he crossed his arms. "That's Headmaster Black to you," he corrected. Sorry, sir," Harry said as he awkwardly stood up. "Thanks for, I guess, trying to save me and Rom, even though we didn't actually need it." The old headmaster stared him down. "Albus may believe your story, boy, but I know what I saw," he said with a deep suspicion. "I don't know what's going on, but I find I'm very curious. Something I haven't been in quite a long time." "There's nothing going on, sir," Harry assured him as he fished his clothes out of the trunk to make a quick escape. "Boy, I've seen more dark magic in my life than that upstart calling himself Voldemort. I know dark magic when I see it, and you, my friend, are not a light wizard," Headmaster Black stated sternly before turning and leaving his portrait. Harry stared at the empty painting in his wake. "Yeah, that's going to end well," Harry muttered sarcastically as he left to change his clothes in the bathroom and get started on whatever that cleaning project that was Mrs. Weasley had been planning to keep his mind off of the hunger that was now gnawing at his stomach. It turned out the library was Harry's favorite room in the house, though he hadn't visited the basement yet. That was probably going to be excellent, judging by his reaction to the aura of the house so far. When he stepped inside, he just wanted to sit and enjoy the almost warm feeling of the room. Everyone else was grumbling, complaining, and decking themselves out in gloves and protective supplies. It helped his feeling of hunger that no one was happy anymore, though. It didn't take long to realize that something was in the room. Something was calling to him. He trailed his dust rag across the shelves in the library, separating from the others and looking for whatever was calling to him. It was like treacle tart or the best chocolate cake. He could almost smell the sugar wafting through the room. There was a treat for him, if only he could find it. A glint of gold caught his eye, and he could feel his Dementor instantly perk up. What in Merlin's name is it with Dementors and shiny things? Harry thought even as his eyes were arrested by the shiny gold locket sitting innocently on the shelf. He took in a deep breath. Food! A soul! There was a soul just sitting there. No body. No one could miss it. Harry was transfixed. His hand inched towards the chain. "Harry! What you touch?" Mrs. Weasley called out in warning. "I haven't looked over those shelves yet." Harry was trying to stop himself, but he didn't think he could. There was no moral directive keeping him from the soul without a body, and he was just so hungry. A loud pop resounded throughout the room before Harry could give himself away by pulling a Gollum and calling the locket "my precious," or something equally mortifying. "Creature was
being distracted by the bad master. The mudbloods and blood traders are taking the treasure of House Black once more. Creature will stop the desecration of the mistress's house, an ancient elf stated as he tried to stare down Molly Weasley. In the distraction, Harry quickly pocketed the locket. The movement caught the attention of the ancient elf, who turned his yellow eyes instantly over to the shelf that no longer contained the locket. Creature is... The elf stopped mid-thought as his gaze fell on Harry, being the obvious one who took the necklace. Instead of yelling at the teen as Harry and probably everyone else in the room expected, Creature let out an inhuman shriek of fear and ran from the room. He didn't apparate or pop or whatever elves do. He just ran in more fear than Harry had ever seen an elf before.
What'd I do?
Harry looked to the others in the room in confusion. Could the elf see him as he really was? That wasn't going to go well when he tried to return to Hogwarts, which had an army of elves in the castle.
No clue, buddy, but you're my cleaning friend from now on,
Ron exclaimed with a smile.
Creature is serious elves that came with the house. He's foul. If you keep him away, you're coming with me everywhere.
Ron, really? He's just responsible to the He's just responding to the ill treatment he's had at Sirius' hand. Hermione berated him. He needs to be shown more kindness and understanding. I'm pretty certain he'd murder you in your sleep if he could get away with it, Ginny informed her as the elf's pure blood beliefs were evident from even that one interaction.
Yeah, maybe we should all move into Harry's room.
George chuckled as his twin rolled his dusting rag and snapped it at his butt. Children, please! Mrs. Weasley sighed in frustration. Just keep cleaning and watch what you touch! Late that night, after moving invisibly through the house to avoid people and snooping portraits, Harry finally found the basement. It was just as wonderful as he had predicted. There were manacles on the stone walls, dampness around the edges of the room, and even some rust-colored stains still on the floor, presumably dried blood. It felt very relaxing and like a home should feel like. Dusty boxes filled the corner of the room. Harry guessed they contained the cursed objects collecting from the house, as their aura seemed warm and inviting to him. He hovered cross-legged over the floor, breathing in the feel of the home in the dungeon, since no one was on that level of the house. Harry even allowed himself the luxury of slightly letting go of his aura, and the room dropped several degrees in temperature. Happily warm for the first time in a long time, Harry pulled the shiny golden locket out of the pocket of his tattered robes. He'd put a lot of thought into those robes since he'd been turned. They were a part of his magic as a Dementor, but they had pockets that seemed too practical for something that must have been the sole purpose of contributing for aesthetic of scary. He did take off the ropes once, so it was possible, but a couple of minutes later they reappeared back on his skeletal body. So much for changing out the ropes for some jeans and a graphic tee. Side note, but if someone has the time, if I don't do it myself, please draw a Dementor in that outfit. Please.
Eerily smiling, the Dementor sat in the basement and stared at the locket, reveling in the feel and smell of it. He could only take the beautiful torture for a minute before he opened his chapped lips and pulled the soul out of the casement and into his body. It really was like eating the best chocolate cake he'd ever had. It was sweet and tangy and just a little bit spicy. Giving off a deep sigh, Harry breathed in relief. That was finally no long as he was finally no longer hungry and had a pleasant full feeling in his stomach. He knew he should be worried about how he'd handle being at Hogwarts. This wasn't normal behavior by any definition of normal, but he pushed those thoughts aside for the moment. He hadn't been at the place since before the Triwizard Tournament. He wanted to enjoy this moment and deal with his anxieties over feeding the Dementor in the morning. Yes, it was a really bad idea. He knew it was a bad idea. Even as he clasped the locket's chain around his neck, he knew it would only cause him problems, but it was just so shiny. After a few scrubs from his robes, the gold shined brightly on the locket engraved with the elaborate script S on its face. The Dementor wanted to be able to see the shine throughout the day and look at it whenever he felt like it. It was either that or steal Dumbledore's star robes. Something told him it was probably the lesser of the two evils. I'm really doing a bang-up job at this whole being normal thing, Harry thought wryly as he walked down out of his bedroom in his Harry suit the next morning, not so proudly wearing the locket around his neck on top of his ratty t-shirt. Self-control, yeah, that's what he desperately needed to work on. At least he wasn't hungry, though. Initially, no one noticed the locket at all. Ron was oblivious to everything except for the food on his plate. The twins couldn't care less what jewelry Harry wore, and Ginny didn't know Harry well enough to know that what necklaces he normally wore or not. Hermione was the first, of course, to realize something was different. Harry, wasn't that in the library we cleaned yesterday? Hermione looked at the prize around Harry's neck in suspicion. Harry shrugged and ate another piece of toast. If everyone was going to flip out and raise a ruckus, he wanted to make sure Jamie was well fed first at least. It's fine, I checked it out. Harry sort of told the truth. He had removed the dark object by eating it first. Pop, did I hear right? Are you wearing something you found in this house? Sirius asked in concern. From where he had been fixing himself a cup of coffee. How are you feeling? Any feelings of unexplained murderous tendencies? Lust for someone you don't know? Self-destructive desires? Harry's godfather asked as he put down the coffee and rushed over to look Harry in the eyes and feel his forehead. You feel a little cold. Is this normal? Molly? Sirius asked, deferring to the mother in the room. Molly's hand took Sirius's place on Harry's forehead. You do feel a little cold, dear, but I don't think it's anything to worry about. How are you feeling? I'm fine, everyone. Harry laughed and grabbed another piece of toast to butter. Really, not everything is cursed, or we wouldn't have beds to sleep on or silverware to eat. One set of silverware was cursed to make the users agree with the masters of the house, Remus stated as he walked into the room. We tossed it and had to use another, even though Sirius protested that he wanted to keep them. What are we talking about? Harry's wearing a locket he found in the library.
Sirius explained in concern to his friend. Remus frowned and immediately started casting spells at the locket.
Harry, can you take it off, please?
The former professor asked, after casting a few spells. The Dementor sighed. It took all his willpower, but he did unclasp the locket and place it on the table.
Well, he can remove it. That's a good sign,
Remus mumbled as he cast a few more spells. Anything? Hermione asked as she looked Harry over, trying to see any changes.
Cool it, Hermione.
Harry scooted farther away from her as she leaned into his personal space.
Really, there's nothing wrong with me.
He's right. I can't find anything wrong with it, Remus finally stated after what seemed like a very long time of countless spells. I don't think it's cursed.
Pop, you can't go scaring me like that.
Sirius sank into the seat beside Harry with a sigh and dramatic clutch to his chest.
You see something you want, you ask me or Remus first, all right? We'll check it over so you don't accidentally curse yourself.
I'm sorry, Padfoot, Harry said, feeling bad at his impulsive actions, though they had been mostly out of his control.
I shouldn't have taken things that are yours anyway.
Sirius laughed and pulled Harry into a one-armed hug.
Pup, you're my only beneficiary in the will. All this is yours anyway. Here!
Sirius picked up the necklace and clasped it around Harry's neck again.
You want this old piece of junk? Then it's yours.
Thanks, Padfoot. Harry smiled and hugged the man back. All right, now that this is settled, the school lists came in today, Mrs. Weasley said in a businesslike manner as she passed Hogwarts letters around in the room. I need your book list and anything clothing or supplies related that you need. Dumbledore is going to send order members to get your things. And as it's not safe for you all, especially Harry, to be wandering around right now. After seeing the shiny badge fall out of Hermione's envelope, Harry's Dementor was actually reasonable enough to be happy to not see something shiny fall out of his. A prefect position was the absolute last thing he needed to have to worry about on top of everything else going on this year. The badge might have been pretty, but the responsibilities was just too much. It was surprising when Ron got one, though. Harry was sure that Neville was the more logical choice, being more of a rule follower anyway. Regardless, as long as it wasn't him, Harry was happy. While all the Weasleys were going through their trunks to determine what they needed, Harry easily passed his list over to Mrs. Weasley, not needing much besides the new books this year. Thanks, dear. We'll just have it charged to your account if that's all right with you. She looked at him questioningly.
Sounds good.
Harry smiled at her and ran off to join Sirius, who was going to show him around the house, to his excitement and the animagus disdain. The tour of Grimmauld Place had been everything Harry hoped it'd be. The rooms that hadn't been contaminated by Mrs. Weasley were glorious. They had various tiny creatures living in the corners and beautifully colored mold. He even found a boggart in an old desk when Sirius had left him for a minute to go to the loo. Like Creature, the boggart immediately ran screaming out of the desk, looking like a copy of Harry's Dementor self, and jumped out of the window into the shadows of the house.
I guess I won't need the boggart repelling spell anymore. Harry mused as he heard Sirius returning. He was beyond grateful he'd been alone when he'd opened the desk cabinet. Harry decided he'd do his main exploring of the house by himself in the coming days in case he ran into another situation like with the house elf and Boggart. The Order of the Phoenix was meeting yet again a couple nights later. It seemed that Snape only joined everyone for dinner when there was an order meeting, and he hid in the corner the whole time. Harry found himself fascinated by the man in an odd way. He never liked Snape. Still didn't. But the professor lived as a spy and needed to just randomly be at the house at odd times and interacted with the order members in a unique way. He hated Sirius and Remus, but he seemed to tolerate the older Weasleys. He actually seemed to get along with the pink-haired Auror named Tonks, strangely, or at least he tolerated her when she made him talk to her. For someone who was hiding every part of himself, the spy who lived in the shadows was an interesting study, at the very least. Harry figured he might learn a thing or two. This night, Snape's eyes seemed to drift to Harry's new locket occasionally, with a speculative look on his face. Harry wasn't sure if the man thought it strange he was wearing a locket, or if he recognized it for some reason. His question was answered when the potions master immediately pulled Dumbledore aside when the elderly man showed up for the meeting. The pair had talked intensely for a couple of minutes, both shooting looks towards where Harry was eating and making the teen feel very self-conscious.
"Ah, Harry, my boy, could I ask you where you found that wonderful necklace?"
Dumbledore said with a smile as he finally walked over to the table. Everyone looked between the headmaster and the student, causing Harry to blush and feel even more self-conscious. I found it in the library," he finally said as he played with the locket nervously. Remus checked it over for curses, though. He said it was fine, and I feel fine too. What's the big deal about me wearing an old dusty necklace anyway? "Mr. Potter, your new adornment just so happens to have the symbol of Salazar slithering on it," Snape drawled from behind the headmaster. "It'd be your luck to stumble on the lost locket of slithering while decontaminating this dump." "Hey!" Harry protested, upset that Snape insulted his house. He wasn't really sure when he had started thinking of Grimmauld Place as his house, but it happened gradually, and he really didn't want to leave now. This place is wonderful. It just needs a little polish and it'll be fine. It's very homey. At this, literally everyone in the room looked at Harry like he may have lost his marbles. Pup? Even I agree with Snape on this one, as much as I hate to admit that." Sirius placed his hand on Harry's head once more. "You're sure you feel okay?" "I'm fine." Harry shrugged his hand off. Stop asking me that."
"Harry, may I please see that necklace?"
Dumbledore now looked like Sirius did that something must be wrong with the teen. Sirius rolled his eyes and took off the locket and placed it on the table again. Dumbledore quickly cast several spells that were probably just repeats of Remus, and then some more complex ones added on to that. The headmaster looked at the necklace in frustration.
"I can't find anything wrong with it,"
he said in amazement.
"I do believe it may actually be Slytherin's lost locket, though."
Does that mean I can't keep it?" Harry asked sadly. He really did like his shiny and didn't have anything else that was that pretty. The adults all seemed to have a silent conversation as they stared at each other. Judging from their emotions that Harry could still feel, Sirius was concerned, Molly and Arthur were both fairly indifferent, Remus was suspicious, Snape was irritated, a little angry for some reason, and Dumbledore was a mix between confused and hopeful.
Well, since there's nothing wrong with it, I don't see why you can't keep it, my boy.
Dumbledore said slowly, Headmaster, you certainly aren't going to allow a student to wear around a Founder's artifact. The potions professor protested in indignation, while almost making the word student sound like a swear word.
I can't prove it's a Founder's artifact at this time.
Dumbledore shook his head.
I may find a way to prove it eventually, but Harry's a responsible lad.
Snape scoffed at that pronouncement.
He'll keep it safe for us until we can determine its authenticity.
Dumbledore finished, ignoring the man. Harry grinned at his headmaster and quickly put the locket around his neck once more.
Thank you, sir. I'll take good care of it. I know you will, my boy.
Dumbledore's eyes twinkled at him.
Now, I need to ask you once again, have you had any visions of Voldemort, or has your scar pained you at any time at all?
No, sir. I'm sorry I don't have anything for you, Harry responded sadly. He really did want to help as long as he was able to keep out of the action and keep Jamie and his secret safe. Dumbledore just smiled brightly though and clapped a hand on his shoulder.
No apologies, Harry! That's good news,
he assured the raven-haired teen happily. Now, everyone off to bed. We need to get this meeting started, and you all need to finish up any homework you've put off until the very last minute tomorrow, Molly Weasley instructed as all the younger inhabitants of the house were shooed out of the kitchen. Hermione grabbed onto Harry and Ron as she followed them both into their room. All right, spill, Harry. What's really going on? She asked him as in a hiss as Ron plopped onto his bed.
Yeah, mate, you've been acting a little off lately,
Ron added, in sounding much less concerned than Hermione. Harry shrugged and pulled his knees to his chest on the bed.
I'm fine, really.
I don't believe you for a second. Hermione crossed her arms and stared at him down. There's something going on. Even the adults are noticing. Hell, even Sirius noticed, and he calls you James half the time. Harry frowned and picked a string on the comfortable.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. Could you both just trust me for now?
He asked hopefully. He knew Hermione and Ron would be the ones to find out. He just wasn't able to tell them. Not yet. Who would want the Dementor hanging around them anyway?
I promise I'm okay. Or as okay as I'm going to be anyway,
he added on.
What's that supposed to mean?
Ron's face clouded in concern. He hadn't thought anything was actually wrong, like Hermione had. He just thought there might be something bothering his friend. Harry shrugged noncommittedly.
Just that if Hermione's right and there is something going on with me, that doesn't mean I'm ready to talk about it, especially if there isn't anything you can do anyway.
But maybe there is something we can do! Hermione sat beside him on the bed and almost pleaded.
Not this time, Hermione.
Harry smiled at her sadly. Really, I'm fine. I'll tell you sometime, but let me process it first, okay? Hermione narrowed her eyes and studied her friend in front of her. I'm not going to let you bottle this up like you always do. I'll give you some space for now. But I'm not letting this go completely. I care too much about you to do that. Of course not, Hermione. Harry laughed. Then you wouldn't be you. You got that right. Ron laughed as well, while Hermione rolled her eyes at them before joining them in laughter. Hey, maybe you could both give me a heads up when I'm acting strangely? That would actually help a lot, Harry asked sheepishly as they stopped laughing. Sometimes I do things without even knowing I'm doing it until everyone is looking at me weird. Maybe you could poke me or something. Ron and Hermione looked at each other in concern, but nodded. How about we come up with a word like pineapple or something that we say when you're doing something off? Ron suggested. Why pineapple? Hermione asked with a smirk and raise of her eyebrow. I don't know. Why not? Ron shrugged. It was the first thing that came to mind. Maybe something a little easier to work into conversation? Harry thought for a moment. Hey, how about you ask me about my friend Jamie? It would change the subject for the conversation to distract from whatever it is I'm doing. Would sound fairly natural, and we don't already have a friend named Jamie. Do you actually have a friend named Jamie? Hermione thought about it with a frown. Harry nodded. Sort of. More like an acquaintance. You think it'd work? Yeah, I think it would. Hermione nodded in approval. I'm concerned about whatever is making you act different, but you still seem to be Harry. Just a little odder. So I'll go with it for now. Yeah, mate, you promise you aren't really a Death Eater polyjuiced as Harry? Ron questioned suspiciously. You tried to turn Scabbers, who was really Wormtail, yellow on our first train ride to Hogwarts. Your dad's car saved us when we went to see the Acromantulas in our second year. Third year, you had a crush on Pansy Parkinson and didn't tell anyone except Neville and me. Fourth year... Yeah, okay, I got it! Ron cut off as he blushed bright red. No need to... Go on, you're Harry, I believe you. Pansy? Really? Hermione laughed heartily. I can't believe you liked Pansy! It was a moment of weakness, Ron grumbled, and threw a pillow at Harry. Hey! Harry threw the pillow back at him before an all-out pillow fight broke out. Well, looky who we have here. A new story, just as promised, and this time Harry Potter. I read this story not long ago, and it had me giggling into the deep of night, so I just had to record it because it's a comedic masterpiece, but also it brings in seriousness. I'm going to do that in sets of 3 to give you a little. Let's just say it's easier because it's quite a long story packed into only 26 chapters. But for now, if you liked it, consider liking and subscribing. It would help out a lot. When this video is out and we haven't reached 500 subs yet, I would strongly suggest subscribing because I've already pre-recorded the 500 subscriber special. Anyway,
Take care, everybody. Do take care of yourself, even if it's only a little bit. Get yourself some chocolate, drink something, even if it's an energy drink, at least hydrate. Try to get at least 3 hours of sleep, or maybe a little more. I know I'm not the best example. Please do as I say, not as I do. Anyways, until next time, laddies and lads and non binary pals. That sounded weird. Anyway, take care. Toodaloo.